Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Foresight Connection webinar series, What Makes an Organization a Best Employer? My name is Christy Kessler, and I'll be your moderator for today's broadcast. We have two wonderful speakers today that I'm very delighted to introduce to all of you, and as we work our way through the agenda, you'll have the opportunity to hear from both individuals. Our first speaker today will be Sharon Parker. She's Director and Senior Consultant with the Foresight Group. She manages many of Foresight's largest clients worldwide, leading the development and implementation of customized surveys and leadership assessments, focusing on employee engagement, customer satisfaction, leadership development, cultural change, and workplace improvement. Parker has co-authored 2 books on web-based survey development and action planning. She's working on her 3rd book currently. She received her master's degree in industrial organizational psychology from Elmhurst College, and she's currently an adjunct professor at that college as well. Our second speaker for today is from Hewitt Associates. This is Marusarz. He's Global Employee Engagement Leader with Hewitt Associates. He has broad-based experience in talent management, employee assessment, and product development. Ted has a number of Hewitt products and services as developers, including Hewitt's current employee and culture products, the Results to Action offer, Hewitt's Best Employer Research, and Employee Attraction Assessment. At this point, I'd like to let everyone in the audience know that our speakers will be taking questions throughout the program today, so please utilize the Q&A panels or the chat panels, and our speakers will take questions throughout the program today. Also, regarding the slides, we will make those slides available to all of our audience after the program. You'll be receiving an email with the information about how you can obtain the slides from today's broadcast. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Sharon Parker, who is going to start by talking a little bit about Foresight's High Performance Benchmark. Welcome to the program, Sharon.
Thank you, Christy, and welcome to all of you who have joined us for today's webinar. As Christy mentioned, I'm going to start and talk a little bit about our high performance benchmark. If you want to go to the next slide, talk a little bit about benchmark data. First of all, what is benchmark data? Our high performance norm is a normative comparison point. It provides some type of framework or comparison data point that lets you know how your organization compares to other organizations who ask the same types of questions on your employee survey. So the high performance benchmark is another way to, again, compare your results to other organizations whose performance in a number of different areas, which I'll share with you in a minute, it helps you understand, are you better than some of those organizations or compare slightly lower than those other organizations. So when we look at benchmark data, it just helps us gain some type of comparison to help us understand what are the areas that we need to work on first, what are those areas we need to improve. The high-performing organizations that we have identified for our high-performance benchmark are financially successful and really do understand how workforce issues help them drive performance. And some of the areas that we look at that they have really identified as driving performance are in the areas of leadership, talent management, and overall employee engagement. So how did we develop this high-performance benchmark? One of the things that we did is we took a look at our overall normative database and looked at the organizations that comprise that overall benchmark and identified 11 organizations in this overall database. These 11 organizations comprise of 7 different industry sectors. There's manufacturing, healthcare, retail, energy, kind of general services, financial services, and communications. So you can see that the organizations in our high-performance benchmark really do comprise a broad cross-section of organizations, different industries, and they're very well represented globally. There are employees in this benchmark that represent and live and work in more than 100 different countries. They're also in private as well as not-for-profit organizations as well as the public sector. So when we took a look at these organizations, trying to determine who should be in this high-performing benchmark, we looked at a number of different factors, which we can see on the next slide. So we based our criteria on three main factors. If you want to look at it, it's kind of three legs of a stool. It's one thing to say you're high performance if you perform well financially, and that was certainly one of the main criteria. Financial performance is a must. So we looked at a number of things, growth as well as profitability. Now, as I showed you earlier in the previous slide, some of the organizations are private companies, some are not-for-profit. So it wasn't just a simple matter of looking at their stock performance or going to the Fortune 100 or Fortune 50 list. So we had to be a little bit creative in trying to identify financial performance. So we did a number of things, searching through a number of different records, sometimes looking through their own performance records to try to figure out, are these companies, one, financially sound, or do they have growth and profitability? Are they financially successful in their particular industry? So that was one criteria. Second criteria was around a focus on the customer. These organizations in the high performance benchmark are also companies that are leaders in their industry and have clearly shown that they do focus on the customer and they have an industry leader and an industry focus in whatever industry they happen to be in. Second of all, because we do also collect their employee survey data, we know that they have a strong focus on the employee. So we know that over the years they've been able to not only have good scores on their employee surveys, but they have improvement measures and show strong organizational performance and alignment to all of the employee survey measures that they tend to look at. So we see a couple of things on the employee side. A strong focus on people, strong visionary leadership capabilities, and a strong focus on the performance measures and human performance leadership. So high retention of employees, career performance, development, some of those factors that they measure that are more people-focused. So, again, this is more setting the stage of why these organizations were selected to be in this high-performance benchmark. Ted is going to talk to you in a minute about what high-performing organizations do and talk more about the Hewitt study on high-performing organizations. This information looks more at the data side. So these organizations that are considered high-performing from a benchmark comparison, what does the data show in terms of normative data? So what does the data show us? The data shows us that when we look at norm scores, just employee data, benchmark data in our normative data, we see significant differences or key differences in a number of areas between these high-performing organizations based on those three criteria and other organizations in our norms. And here are the significant areas. Senior leadership, communications and feedback, how they allocate resources, the tools and resources that people have, areas of teamwork and involvement, rewards and recognition, how they hold people accountable for their jobs, and then engagement more specifically around intent to stay. So again, looking at questions and looking at these key areas, this is where we see significant difference in the normative data between those high-performing organizations, which does represent over 1 million people, 1 million responses, and other organizations in our normative database. So on the next couple of slides, what I wanted to do is show to you just a couple of the questions from our normative database. We want to give away the whole shop, but wanted to give you some idea of some of the questions that we've asked and some of the differences in score. So if just to read the charts that we have here, the blue part of the bar is our percent favorable. That's the percent of employees that said I agree or strongly agree. The white is the neutral, and the yellow part is the unfavorable, those that said they disagree or strongly disagree. And you can see then the percentage point difference between high performance and average benchmark, which is the 50th percentile, on the first one, which is senior management gives employees a clear picture of the direction the company is headed. This is about strategy. High performance is 7 percentage points higher than the average. The next question is about tools and resources, and high performance is 10 percentage points higher than the average. And then the third question on this particular page is about teamwork. High performance, again, is 10 percentage points higher than the average benchmark. On the next slide, we look at a question around rewards. People are rewarded according to their job performance. This question, though, is actually more about, not just about rewards, it's also about holding people accountable. So when we look at accountability, and therefore then also the distribution of rewards, high-performing organizations are actually 19 percentage points higher on this particular question based on the average benchmark. So you can see a very big difference between high-performing organizations and our average benchmark on that particular question. And then the last question I wanted to highlight was the intent to stay. And we all know the effects of turnover in organizations, and this is voluntary turnover, and how much turnover can cost an organization. And here you see an 11 percentage point difference between high-performing organizations and other organizations on that intent to stay question. So 81% of employees in high-performing organizations say they intend to stay with the organization in the next 12 months. Now, we may see that shift a little bit in the next couple of years as with the economy, the changes may impact normative benchmark scores, but right now we see a significant difference between high performance and those and the rest of the benchmarking data. So from our perspective, when we look at how employees respond to survey scores, and this is all, again, all based on self-perceptions of what employees think about their organizations, employees in high-performing organizations do tend to see things differently than employees in other organizations. And specifically around those areas that I highlighted in a previous slide, leadership, teamwork, accountability, allocation of resources, and certainly around performance and intent to stay. So I wanted just to share that and actually sort of lead into that as Ted then talks about a high-performance study that they've run at Hewitt, and you'll see then some of the practices that lead into some of these employee perceptions.
And Sharon, just before Ted speaks, a question has already come in from Grayson in the audience, and the question, and I left this slide up for a reason, is what would you consider a sizable or meaningful difference in scores between high-performing and typical organizations?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, when you're looking at benchmark data like this, we're talking about a very large sample size. We're talking about millions and millions of responses. And that high-performance benchmark, is really based on, what I say, 1.1 million responses. A significant, actually a statistically significant difference would be a 1 percentage point change. So when you're looking here at this one question where there's a 19 percentage point difference, that is not only statistically significant, but that's actually very meaningfully different. So because our benchmark data has such a large sample size, you could say that even a 1 percentage point difference is significant.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate it. That is really some amazing differences between the high-performing benchmark and those of typical or average organizations. At this point in our program, we're going to segue over to Ted, who's going to spend some time throughout today's program talking about best employer research and practices. Ted, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining the call today. I really appreciate it. Those of you who are in the Midwest are probably struggling with some of the weather, or at least the forthcoming weather, so we really appreciate you joining the call. I'm going to actually cover 4 topics in today's call. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology around best employers, then also what makes the best employers and what the best employers have in common, and those 2 topics will overlap a bit. And then finally, talk a little bit about some of the benefits of being a best employer. And again, as you saw, feel free to send across any questions that you have as we're going through the program. So first of all, basically, we started doing best employer studies in the late 90s. We started off by doing them in Latin America, and then in early 2000, we added them in Asia and in Australia, then expanded to Europe in 2002, to Latin America in 2005, and in 2009 we expanded to the Middle East. You know, in addition to best employers, we do a top company for leaders study that we've also done 4 ways globally. So what we do is we're actually able to integrate information both from our best employer research and also from the top company for leaders research. And one of the interesting things about doing this work across the different markets and the different regions is it actually allows us to understand the different ways that organizations and the different ways that cultures think about people and, you know, some of the different practices and maybe even, you know, some of the different levels of sophistication that they have when they're actually doing planning around performance management or leadership or whatever the case might be. The other piece of this is that, you know, and we get this question a lot, is, you know, how do different things that go on in the world besides what's going on in your company affect your company's performance? So we've had the whether you call it the opportunity or whatever you want to call it, of doing this through lots of periods of change. You know, so over the past 10 years, you know, we've had financial crises, you know, we've had IT meltdown, we've had flu scares, we've had increases in terrorism, and not only have we continued to do the best employer study, we've actually found some interesting things about organizations that continue to be the best. And this has also allowed us to focus on specific industries. So, for example, you know, after the 9/11 terrorist attack, we took a hard look at the airline industry and how they were responding and what they were doing to basically rebound. You know, also that impacted during the flu scare. That impacted a lot of travel between the U.S. and Asia, actually between Asia and everywhere. You know, we've had the IT meltdown. We've been looking at financial services organizations during the course of the subprime crisis that happened a couple of years ago. And then also, most recently, you know, the banking industry was actually hit the hardest and the soonest by the financial industry, and we actually found, you know, those that did well and those that actually struggled a bit. So just talk a little bit about the background. When we do a best employer study, we actually collect information from 3 groups of stakeholders. So we first start off by collecting information from the CEO. So on that, we actually, and I'll actually get into a little bit of detail. We also collect an employee engagement survey or an employee opinion survey, and then the third piece is the people practices inventory. We collect all of that information, we process it, and we provide it to a judging panel on a blind basis. So basically, they get the data from the organization, but they don't have any information about the organization size, the organization name, the organization industry. And what they're doing is they're actually assessing the organization based on their performance, their people practices, the experience that employees are having in the organization. And then what ends up happening is then we actually announce the best employers. Once we announce the best employers, we go back and we analyze all of the data that we've collected to find out what are the characteristics that are similar or different. First of all, similar across best employers, and then different between best employers and people who actually participated but didn't make the best list. The type of information, to elaborate a bit, the type of information that we collect is, in the employee opinion survey, we collect our engagement data, engagement drivers, leadership practices, manager practices, perceptions of HR effectiveness, and we've also done some special topics where we've looked at individual psychology. So, for example, we've looked at locus of control, or we've looked at facet 5. We looked at resilience, both from an employee perspective and from an organizational perspective, and we also looked at employee well-being. And by that I mean, you know, what type of an environment is it? Are the employees, you know, feeling well in the organization, feeling that they're contributing? And we're not talking here about work-life balance. We're really talking about sort of the stress and the emotional turmoil that. So, you know, we've done a couple of studies on instability and sort of the toxic work environment. We also did cultural alignment work. So basically, how well is the culture aligned, you know, within the organization across levels, and how well is it aligned from the people's expectations versus the delivery? In the people practices inventory, and this is actually, you know, some of the feedback that we've gotten has been a bit of painstaking work for organizations to take on, because it's a long questionnaire, and it takes several days to complete it, because we collect a lot of information on HR effectiveness, their spending, pay differential effectiveness, high-performance workforce practicing, mentoring programs, performance management, training, diversity information. We collect just a lot of information. And then we go to the CEO survey, and there we actually let the CEO off the hook by actually having him fill out a relatively short survey that gets around strategic alignment, value alignment. So, what does the leader see as the strategy of the organization, so we can actually determine whether employees are aligned with that strategy and things like that. And then in addition, we collect a lot of information on company performance. So that's customer satisfaction, employee retention, customer retention, financial performance. And I'll start off at a pretty high level and basically say, we see employees, particularly in this last cycle when we've actually been doing this study during the 2009 meltdown, that the best employees excel in a couple of areas, and one of them is pretty much staying with the basics. So they've actually implemented pretty good people practices, and they're not responding dramatically to any changes in the economy. So what they're basically saying is, we've developed good practices, we have a resilient organization, and what we're actually able to do is we're actually able to ride out a lot of these by sticking to our basics. And that actually does a lot of things, in addition to demonstrating to employees that the company is sound and solid. You're not creating confusion in the employee population. And then the second thing, and this is actually been really interesting because we've seen a lot of organizations struggle with this, is keeping the managers empowered, basically making sure that managers can provide, the managers have the autonomy to make decisions, the managers have the ability to run their own business, the managers actually have the capability to do their role. And the reason I point that one out is that we've seen in a number of organizations where decision-making has sort of moved up the ladder, so that, in essence, in the past, a manager could have basically made decisions about travel budget or training budget, and now it requires another level of approval. And so they've actually taken away some of the autonomy from the managers, put it in the hands of senior folks, and you sort of wonder what's going to happen as the economy starts to recover. How do you get managers to sort of take that on again once you've taken it away from them? Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about what makes the best employer in terms of strategy and tactics. So, one of the things that I mentioned was this consistent execution of programs. So I'll use one example, but I'll also give you a couple of other brief examples. But we actually see when organizations are implementing programs, they actually go through sort of three phases. So the first phase is, we have that in place. So we have a managing performance system. And actually, for those companies, I'll say it's not really a managing performance system, but it's a performance management system. So it's an online system. Managers have to get notified a week or two before it's due to make sure you collect feedback and fill out the form. The form's filled out, there's a conversation with the employee, goes in the records, and it's pretty much done. Then sort of phase two is how the system is used. And what we start to see here is that best employers really use it differently. So first of all, they tend to balance goals more between financial and non-financial measures. So there's development goals in the employees' goal setting. They also set the bar higher in terms of performance ratings. So one of the things that we actually end up seeing among the best employers is that they will have more individuals who will receive a do not meet expectation rating than the bottom employers. So they actually hold them more accountable, and employees actually want to be held more accountable. And then they actually equip their managers to have a performance review that's more effective. So basically, performance review provides both feedback that's positive and also areas for improvement. And the performance feedback is not a one-time event. It's not a check the box. It's something that's ongoing. And then the last thing is that they actually attribute the performance management system, the managing performance system, to driving organizational results. So here's a bit of data that supports that. So you can see that among the best, 70% of organizations set aggressive goals as opposed to among the rest. And the rest of those participants that didn't make the survey, that they basically have about 55%. Then if you look at pay for performance, basically, what they find, and looking at the second line, where we provide higher remuneration to high performers, So you see a big difference, 61% versus 40%. So employees are actually seeing that if they perform well, they'll actually get paid better. And then the other one is again succession planning. So, what we actually find is, do organizations have succession plans? And we find that not only do the best have succession plans, but that they actually fill most positions from within. So they actually are creating career opportunities. Whereas the other companies, you see that about 1 out of 2 positions are filled from within. And then, obviously, this is all interesting from an academic perspective, but what we also actually find is that, the further you drive that impact, the bigger the result that you get from a financial perspective. And we see this time and time again, and I'll actually show you some of the results in terms of what best employers experience when we get to that section of the presentation. And then in terms of persistent development of managers, what we actually see is that, basically, first of all, managers are well aligned with the organizational people practices. So basically, they are using the people practices that are actually in the organization as opposed to necessarily saying, I can't work in this system. They're also holding employees more accountable for setting aggressive goals. So if you look in the bottom box for the third from the bottom, managers hold employees accountable for setting goals. You see 67% among the best and basically half among the rest. So you see a lot more accountability. You also see managers more directly addressing issues of poor performance. And again, they can do that because they have the autonomy to actually take that on as opposed to basically needing to have to go back and check with somebody.
And touching on questions just came in from Sophia in the audience is, can organizations still remain best employers with this challenging economy?
Well, actually, that's a really good question, and I'll actually answer it in sort of 2 and 3 parts. So depending on how many I remember. But first of all, one of the things that we actually found historically, even before doing studies in the 2009 time frame, is that there were a number of organizations that went through an RFI process where they actually reduced their workforce and made the best employer list subsequent year. So they actually were able to handle that very well. In the current economic crisis, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been tracking quarterly changes in engagement relative to the last year. So an organization that did a study, let's say in 2008, and then doing it again in 2009. And historically, we actually found that about 50% of organizations would improve engagement, and about 15% would have a decline in engagement. And by improvement, I'm talking about a 4% increase or 4% decrease, and the other 35% fell in the middle. And so what we actually found is when the economy took a downturn, there was an increase in the number of organizations that had declining engagement. So that number went up from about 15% to about 30%. But the number of organizations that were maintaining or improving engagement, or I should say improving engagement, still stayed in that 50 range, maybe sort of in the 40 range. It's dropped off a bit now. But if we actually look at the starting engagement score, it was actually the organizations that had higher engagement that were actually more likely to maintain engagement because, again, they already had programs in place, and they were actually not so much responding to the crisis as opposed to adjusting for it.
That makes absolute sense, to adjust for the crisis. And that segues into what do these best employers have in common?
Right, and this is actually one of the most fun things to talk about because at one level it looks so easy, and then at another level what we do is we see organizations struggle with this. But basically when we look at the things that best employers have in common, and again, this is in good times and bad. This is also in whether you're doing a study in the Middle East, or you're doing a study in the UK, or you're doing a study in Budapest, we see these consistent patterns. And again, the way they actually implement them could be a bit different. But it starts with leadership commitment. And I won't talk about too much about that right now because I'll get into a little bit more detail on each of them. But it really means that leaderships are out front, visible to employees, and committed to employees. And the second thing is a compelling promise to employees. And this doesn't have to be a promise of, God, this is a fantastic place to work, it's the best place to work. But what you need to do is you need to tell people, if you come here, this is the experience that you'll have, and then deliver on that experience. And I'll give you an example of a company that actually creates a bad experience and employees understand it and respond to it. Then there's a connection to the company and strategy. So basically, do you know what the company is trying to accomplish? And then do you know what you need to do to help them accomplish that? Differentiated high-performance culture. And by that what we mean is, certainly, having a hypo program, but it's also making clear that what you do is you differentiate your message for each employee so that, in essence, the employees basically know. So your high-performance people, they need to be treated as special. They need to have special treatment because those are the ones that are, your top 5, 10%. Your solid performers, which is basically, the 80% of the people who basically show up and do a good job on a daily basis, they need to feel motivated. And then your poor performers, they need to be focused on that there's a requirement for them to change. And the requirement to change could be change your behavior or change where you work. And organizations are actually pretty clear. The best companies are pretty clear about that. Your behaviors don't match up with what we need. We're willing to help you correct them, but if you can't correct them, you should seek someplace else where your behaviors are aligned with that company's strategy. And then we have aligned people practices, and while that seems trivial, basically what I mean by that is literally, a simple example is paying people for what you want them to do. See number of occasions and organizations where you tell people this is what I want, but when the reward cycle comes up, it's basically people are being paid for different things. So it creates that behavior. And then what we'll do is later we'll talk about the outcomes of being a best employer. So that means engaged employees, satisfied customers, exceptional business performance. So let me go into a little bit of detail. So first of all, I mentioned leadership commitment, and basically, what we mean by that is that leaders basically hold people, basically make it clear to everybody that people are important for the business to succeed. They create an important picture for the organization, a compelling promise for the employees, and they instill a culture of accountability. So they're open, they're involved, and what you can see is that when you look at the ratings of leaders in best companies versus the rest, you see a 30-point difference in terms of a score of 80 relative to a score of 53. The other thing that we do, one of the other analyses that we do is we do this analysis that actually shows the impact of various drivers and people in the organization on engagement. And this is an example from one organization, but it's pretty indicative of what we see. But you can see how pervasive the impact that senior leadership has on a number of elements in the organization, whereas the manager tends to have more of an impact on recognition and maybe the day-to-day work. Senior leaders have an impact on whether the employees feel valued and how the policies are set up, what kind of communication, whether the employees feel recognized, a number of things. And then, the other aspect of it is, if you don't see leadership commitment, or if you don't even see, and here we're actually turning a little bit from leaders being committed to their employees to leaders being engaged in working at the organization, if you don't see high levels of engagement, what you do is you see this trickle-down effect. So basically, the two lines here represent levels of the organization and engagement levels, and the top bar is engagement levels by level of the organization in the best companies. And what you see is that in those organizations, 91% of leaders are engaged. And what that means is, looking at it another way, 9 out of 10 times that an employee interacts with a leader, they'll actually have a positive experience from an engaged leader. In the rest organizations, you see 75% engaged. So literally what that means is 1 out of 4 times an employee will have an experience with a leader who's not engaged. And so you see that trickle-down effect where basically engagement drops down at each level. So the people who report to senior manager are less engaged, the people at the middle management is less engaged, and so on and so forth. And once you start to get that downward spiral, it's actually hard to recover from it. The next thing that I want to talk about is the compelling promise to employees. And so basically, when employees are joining an organization, they really want to know what it's all about and what they should expect there. And then when they join the organization, what they want to do is they want to actually make sure that the company delivers on the promises that it makes. And one of the things that we find consistently is when somebody's joining an organization, the company goes through a pretty intensive process to recruit that person. And sometimes during that recruiting process, what could end up happening is you can overpromise. So employees get there, and then all of a sudden they start to feel like the company's not delivering on the promises it makes. So one example that I was actually going to mention is one of the organizations that we work with and has made our best employer list time and time again with an engagement score that's actually pretty close to 90. Is an organization that does sales force outsourcing. So, for example, if you want to sell a product and you don't have a sales force, you actually outsource the work to them. Or if you have a product and you want a customer complaint department, you don't have a customer complaint department, you actually outsource that work to them. So when they recruit people, what they actually tell them is, when you join this organization, most of the work experiences that you have dealing with customers are going to be very negative, because people are going to be mostly saying no to you. No, I don't want to buy that. But they're mostly going to be saying, I bought this product from you and it doesn't work. And so they're going to be having fairly negative experiences. And so what they've actually decided during the recruiting process is, we're going to promise you many negative experiences in dealing with customers, many positive experiences in dealing with your fellow employees, and the ability to switch jobs on a regular basis. So what you could do is you could, talk to people about different products, try to sell different products, and hone your skills. And they actually, when the CEO came to accept his Best Employer Award, he actually came with, we said to him he wanted to show a video. We said to him he could show a 1-minute video of what goes on in the organization. He came with about a 10-minute video about, people having a good time there and just enjoying themselves. And again, very high retention rate. So the point there is that, it's not that it has to be a promise that this is the best place, but it has to be a promise of this is what you're going to experience. And, you can see that, these best organizations actually, they deliver on the promise, they make employees feel treated, valued, the work processes allow them to be productive, and they're paid for the contribution. So you can see that they're actually continuing to do that. And the other aspect is, one of the things that we actually asked organizations during the process, this is in the people practices inventory, is we actually asked them what their brand characteristics are. So what are they actually promising? And the big difference that we found between best employers and non-best employers are, first, they're more clear about their brand characteristics. So they actually identify them more clearly. And the second is that they're more focused on employees. So they're more focused on caring, on recognition, on career advancement. Whereas if you look at the rest, there was a lot lower focus on employee and much more focus on the customer, on the challenge, on the excellence. So there are some differences that we see in terms of what they promise. And then the other thing that we actually looked at is doing a survey in terms of how well do organizations deliver. So what you can see is that we asked people, why did they join an organization? You can see they joined this organization because it was going to be fun. They joined this organization because it was going to care about the employees. And then what did they actually deliver on? They actually deliver on basically being hypercritical, being under-resourced and stuff like that. So, this is the place where we actually see that big disconnect between what you tell people it's going to be like to work here and what the actual experience is. And so what happens in that kind of a situation? So this is a chart, again, that shows the engagement level. Now it shows them by tenure. So what you see is the best employers, basically what they do is they basically have engagement level that actually stays relatively constant with tenure, whereas among the worst or the rest, what ends up happening is you see a pretty big drop-off after a 6-month period. So engagement starts off relatively high, but again, not as high as the best, and it sort of drops off and takes a long time to recover. And whenever we see this type of a pattern, the first question that we actually ask organizations is, what are you promising employees, and what are you delivering? And this is an aggregate pattern. If we actually segment the organization, we actually see that there are a couple of patterns to make that up. For example, there's some organizations where you see a much bigger drop-off and no recovery, and other organizations where you see a much shallower drop-off. And again, those would indicate some different types of patterns. Then the next thing is the connection to the company and strategy. So how good of an understanding do the employees have of being able to understand the company's goals and basically contribute to it? Again, we see about a 20-point difference between the best employers and the rest. And now moving on to a differential, high-performance culture. First of all, you can see that among the best employers, what they do is they are able to position the organization in a way that makes the employees makes them want to contribute to the organization's success. And again, you see now a 30-point difference in this. And then if we look at other elements of this, what we actually see is that, first of all, on the left, you can see that performance has a significant impact on pay. And then the second, and this is a manager question, that managers are actually rewarded for developing high performance. And again, I was making the point that when we talk about a high-performance culture and a differentiated culture, again, we're not just talking about focusing on high performance, but basically making sure that what you're doing is clarifying the message that you want to send to each individual based on their sort of standing or their contribution to the organization. And then the last one that I wanted to actually mention was the aligned people practices, and this is where the organizational practices create a positive work environment. But the thing that I want to go back to is, what are people recognized and rewarded for? So we actually worked with one organization that was a large shipping company, and they wanted to change the behavior of their employees so that what they would do is they would actually focus on the customer as opposed to focus on loading and unloading trucks. But basically, on the docks, the managers were actually going by and criticizing employees for taking extra time to make sure that they stacked something so that it wouldn't break. And so, in essence, what would end up happening is you'd end up in the same place. Customers would end up with damaged goods because basically people were sort of rushing to get them done. And so what they were doing is they were saying customer service is important, but I'm going to criticize you if you try to do something that will actually make the package get to the customer more safely. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reward you for being fast. And the speed leads to mistakes. And again, we see that time and time again. One of the things that I would actually challenge you on as you're listening to this, when you get back to your, back to your organization, you get a chance to interact with your people, ask them two questions. Ask them, one, what does it mean to work here? What have we promised you? What's the experience that you're expecting? And see what kind of an answer you get, if you get an answer. And then the second is ask people, how they feel that their pay influences their performance, their behavior, and see what kind of response you get. Trying to get a sense of what do people think they're being paid to do. And I think you might find some surprises. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about best employer benefits.
Before you jump into that, I want to paraphrase a question that came in from Johan in the audience, and he says much of the success of a best employer seems to hinge around the senior management's ability to consistently deliver the organization's brand promise to employees. And what advice do you give to organizations faced with such, rapid change and economic factors or global factors, and those that are trying to struggle to live out the organization's missions and strategies around those people practice initiatives?
And again, thanks again. That's a really good question. That's a question that we've gotten, quite a bit over the past, as you can imagine, 6 to 9 months. Is what do we do? So, we've made a promise never to lay people off, and yet we're faced with an economic situation where our finances are coming in at 70% of target. And so, how do we deal with that? And so, the first thing that these organizations do is they actually go back to their values, to their promise, and say, what are we about? And then what they do is they say, how can we actually develop programs that are actually consistent with what we're about? So when we actually interviewed the CEOs from the Best Employer Study, the winners last January, basically 100% of them said that they were planning no layoffs. And of that 100%, I would say that over 90% basically managed to make it through the year without actually laying anybody off. And they did a couple of things around that. Some of it was basically focusing on saying, does anybody want to take time off right now? So in some organizations, people literally took 6 months off and said, I'll come back in 6 months. Other organizations went through a reduction. So there were some voluntary reductions in pay. So we're going to reduce everybody's pay by 10%. And then other places, there were some voluntary reductions in amount of time worked. So since there's less work, maybe we can work less. And so in essence, what they were trying to do is avoid sort of that toxic environment of basically people being concerned. And then the other aspect of it, and this is the part that is probably a little bit tougher, but it's probably equally important, is how do you communicate with your employees? And the longer the time period between communication and the employee's understanding of it, the longer it will be that employees will start to seek their own information. They'll make up things, and they'll basically say, there's going to be layoffs, there's going to be this. And so, what you need is you need leaders to stand up at that time and be counted and basically say, so this is what we're about, and this is how we plan to get through this time. And they have to be completely open to the point of basically saying, there's some things that are coming that are going to impact us, but we don't know exactly what the impacts will be. As soon as we know what the impact will be, what we'll do is we'll come back to you and tell you how we're going to react to it. It's a volatile environment, and we're trying to actually respond in the least volatile way. And that's what we've actually seen organizations do.
Those are great questions. I mean, ideas to make sure that employees have flexible options, significantly enhancing communication efforts, whether it's more frequent, very honest, very open. I think it's okay for a CEO to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do know, and here's what I can tell you. So that's great information. Why don't you tell us a little bit now about some of the best employer benefits?
Sure. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we see consistently is that best employers continue to maintain high engagement. And what you see is this 20 to 25 point gap that's been pretty consistent, over the past 5 years, and also true in 2009. The second thing that we actually see is the percentage of satisfied customers. And this is actually a bit challenging to get information, but nonetheless, we're actually able to pull it off, which is, the reason I say that is, it's not like we actually conducted a survey among the customers. What we did is we actually asked the employees, the organizations, to provide their customer satisfaction data, and obviously it came in multiple forms, multiple scales, and so what we did is we actually looked at, what are some of the highest or top 2 scores, and basically pulled the information from that. We also measured productivity, and the way we measured productivity was basically on a revenue per employee basis. So that in essence, what we actually did is looked at changes in year 1, year 2, and year 3. So we actually collected data for the 3 previous years from the participants and basically looked at their changes. And you can see that in each year there was an increase. And these years actually represent 06, 07, and 08. And so 07 was a bit of a weaker year financially, across the board, but still best employers outperformed by 33%, than 8% to 6%. There was a growth in profit, basically in year 1 and year 2. And then, the other thing, and this is an ongoing study that's actually done by Wharton's College, and this is basically focused on the best employers in the U.S. So what they actually do is they take the Fortune 100 list, which Hewitt actually worked on that back in the 90s, and they identified the top 100 companies, and then they compared those 100 companies to the broad stock market, the S&P 500, and you can see what the 3-year return, the 5-year return, and the 10-year return is. So while I'm not giving out any stock tips, I'm just passing along information. You can sort of see what the benefit was from being a best employer. So one last thing, and what we've actually done is we've developed this global, we call it an engageometer or engageometer, depending on how you pronounce it. And based on this, what we've done is we've actually classified organizations into zones. So there's the high performance zone, and that's an engagement score of 65. And that translates to basically saying we have 2 engaged employees at a minimum for every 1 disengaged employee. And then we have the indifferent range, and I know a lot of organizations don't like that term, but the way we actually talk about it is that the employees are actually indifferent, because for every engaged employee, roughly, you have 1 disengaged employee. And then what we have is the serious and the disruptive zone, where you basically have roughly 2 disengaged employees for each engaged employee. And we think of it as, in the high performance zone, employees are creating value. In the indifferent zone, they're based sort of neutral toward creating value, because there's a wash between engaged and disengaged. And then in the serious and disruptive zone, they're actually destroying value. And if you look at the total shareholder return for those 3 zones, what you see is that in the green zone, it's 19% above average, and in the red zone, it's 44% below average. And just total shareholder return, what that actually refers to is stock appreciation plus dividends. So, how much does the stock go up, and how much does the company pay in dividends? Okay, so that's it for what makes the best employer.
That's fantastic. And you know, we have got a number of questions coming in, so I hope we can spend a little bit more time together through the remaining segment of our hour together today and answer some of these questions that are coming in from the audience. So if you do have additional questions, please ask them. The first one's coming in from Sabrina, and she's asking whether you have found any data related to agricultural biotech industry and how the best employers' characteristics might have changed.
Yeah, so we've done a number of industry analyses, and I can't actually say that we've done that one specifically. We'd have to actually go back and look at the data. But you know, typically in our study, we have participants from a good 20 different industries. So I'd have to actually look back at that one. Sorry, I can't answer that off.
Another question that came in was, you spoke of something called TSR. Is it a total survey response? Or just trying to understand the information we're talking about.
Yeah, so TSR is total shareholder return. And so basically the way it's calculated is, let's suppose the stock price is at $10, and then at the end of the year it's $11. So the stock price would have gone up by $1 or 10%. And then let's say the company also pays out 50 cents in dividends. So that means that the stock price plus the dividends would have gone up by $1.50. So $1.50 over $10 is 15%. So total shareholder return for that in that situation would be 15%.
That makes sense. I hope that clarifies it for Joanne and our audience who had that question. She's trying to wrap her arms around the information that was shared today. I also want to let everyone know that we will be making the slides available from today's program to everyone. You'll be receiving an email from our education coordinator who will send out the details about receiving these slides for today's broadcast. I'd like to thank both Ted and Sharon for their time today. I know it's a busy holiday season. I was lucky enough to be able to get two fantastic speakers to end our series this year. We've enjoyed having all of you a part of our Foresight Connection webinar series that's run every month throughout this year. We are going to be kicking off our 2010 series in early February with an interesting program coming up on February 10th. And you will all receive information and details about that program. I also want to make mention that if, for example, you have some topics that you'd like to hear, we're happy to make sure we find the best and the brightest speakers to talk about individual topics that you might have. So please contact Kate, our coordinator, who will be happy to gather the information you might have for topic requests for our series. For individuals that are utilizing participating in Sharon's HRCI approval, this is a pre-approved webinar, and the HRCI approval program number for today's broadcast is 55857. That's 55857. You'll be able to receive your recertification credits for participating in today's program. This wraps up our series. I want to again thank Ted and Sharon for their time today, and wish everyone a very wonderful, happy holidays to each of you wherever you travel around the globe. Thank you very much for being a part of today's broadcast, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Christy.
You're welcome.